What you're about to hear nearly shattered diplomatic protocol in front of cameras, donors, and international guests. Why did a former US president suddenly point at a British royal guard and demand his arrest? Security moved in, phones went up, and then the guard raised his hand, but not to surrender. What he revealed silenced the entire room. No shouting, no scandal, just one sealed envelope and a line no one dared cross. Now, before we reveal exactly what was inside, first, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The stones outside Lancaster House still glistened with the last of the rain. Not enough to soak through shoes, but just enough to darken the flagstones, to dampen hems, to remind everyone stepping out of their government cars or black cabs that this was London. And London never gives you perfect weather on important days. Inside, the air was already shifting, a familiar blend of cologne, fresh polish, and tension. Waiters in white gloves moved like ghosts past huddled clusters of diplomats and cultural envoys. Velvet ropes had been placed with mathematical precision to divide press from delegates, donors from government staff. The flashes from cameras were already beginning, the low, constant thrum of lenses waking up, shutters warming like insects at dusk. And by the west corridor, perfectly still and near silent, amid the hum of international posturing, stood Staff Sergeant Ewan Hart. Scarlet tunic, white leather belt, and boots shined to regulation gleam. Coldstream Guards, seconded to the Royal Collection and Diplomatic Security Off for liaison duty. A familiar sight in an unfamiliar context. They're not as spectacle, but as structure. His assignment wasn't crowd control. It wasn't protection detail. It was corridor integrity. He wasn't there to react, only to prevent unauthorized movement, unsafe proximity, unsecured access. Observe, protect. Intervene only when protocol required, no more. Beside him, placed on a narrow ledge of table between two floral displays, rested a sealed envelope. Thick cream paper, red wax edge, and the small green tag that marked it for Palace archives. A registered object awaiting a government registrar once the forum ended. Not confidential, not secret, just traceable. Witnessed, logged. Ewan had signed for it earlier that day. Witness only, not carrier. Around him, the forum unfolded in layers. Cultural liaisons, greeting foundation donors. Mid-level officials, smiling with eyes that didn't match their mouths. Members of the US delegation arriving with mirrored earpieces and low-talking aides. Somewhere in the building, a reception suite had been converted into a temporary green room for high-ranking guests. Lancaster House was good at that, pretending it hadn't noticed the rearrangement of power, as long as the floors stayed waxed. A steward passed quietly behind Ewan, adjusting a velvet stanchion that had drifted 2 inches too far to the left. As he moved, he whispered just loud enough to be heard, "Keep the west corridor clear, Sergeant. VIP's team is sensitive." The tone wasn't sarcastic, just tired. Ewan didn't turn his head. He didn't answer. His reply, as always, was posture. Somewhere down the east corridor, radios crackled. And just past the main doors, a cluster of press began murmuring, quiet, urgent, curious. There was talk now, more than rumour, that a certain former US president, no longer in power, but still powerful in other ways, was scheduled to appear. Not for cameras, not for speeches, just for a closed-door panel, a handshake, a presence, a reminder. His team had already arrived, and they'd already begun watching the guard. The rope line wasn't thick. A simple loop of red velvet, fastened to brass posts like it belonged in a museum more than a diplomatic venue. But to Staff Sergeant Ewan Hart, it might as well have been a blast wall. The purpose wasn't force, it was boundary. And boundaries mattered here more than ever. On the other side, beyond that rope, gathered a different sort of crowd. Not diplomats, not military, influencer class. Young, sharp-eyed, dripping with access badges and rental tuxedos. They clustered near the cordon with the confident buzz of people who thought they were important, or who had at least convinced others they might. Phones in hand, arms angled just right. All of them waiting for a moment. Something viral, word had spread. The former US president's name was now on everyone's lips. Some whispered it like a threat, others like an opportunity. One of the influencers, a man in suede loafers with bleached blonde hair and a lapel pin that didn't match the event's theme, leaned over the rope slightly, just enough that the soft bulge of his wrist crossed into Yuan's corridor. He wasn't aggressive, just careless, trying to get a better angle on a lanyard, maybe a glimpse of the American delegation's aides. Yuan didn't touch him. He didn't need to. One precise pivot. A small motion from parade rest to the kind of quiet tension only trained eyes would catch. The gloved hand rose, not a warning, not a threat, just an anchor in the air. "Stand by the rope, please." The voice was low, civil, firm enough to part water. It worked. The man froze. So did the group around him. Cameras still held high, but arms eased back like animals suddenly aware they were too close to the fence. The moment passed without confrontation, but it didn't go unnoticed. June, one of the house stewards, mid-40s, navy blazer, tablet tucked under her arm, stepped forward with the easy authority of someone who knew how to speak quietly without inviting argument. "This space is designated for fire egress and restricted passage," addressing no one in particular but commanding the group. "Please remain behind the stanchions." One of the influencers gave a nervous chuckle. "We're not trying to storm the gates or anything." June didn't flinch. "Let's not even pretend to." That ended the jokes. Phones stayed raised, but lower. Commentary turned to whispers. And in the middle of it all, Yuan didn't move again. The velvet rope held, not because it was strong, but because the man behind it didn't need to say more than one sentence to remind them why it was there. The corridor stayed clear, but the air had shifted. People were watching the guard now. Not for entertainment, for permission. It wasn't just symbolism that put Staff Sergeant Yuan Hart on the West Corridor, it was geometry. Lancaster House had been renovated more than once to accommodate modern diplomacy, but the bones of the place were still Edwardian, designed for formality, not flexibility. That meant choke points, corners that funneled power into narrow spaces. The West Corridor was one of them. It connected the side service lift to a green room used for off-camera arrival staging. On paper, it wasn't part of the public flow, but tonight it mattered. There were only two reliable access points to that corridor. One visible from the main ballroom, the other tucked behind a freight elevator used for logistical staff and discreet arrivals. Both turned sharply before opening into a panel chamber with no camera coverage. From a security standpoint, it was neutral ground. From a narrative standpoint, it was dangerous. No press, no crowd, no accountability. Yuan knew this. That's why he stood where he stood. From his position, he could see both junctions and the narrow run between them. If someone cut across the line or approached unlogged, he'd catch it before anyone else even knew they'd entered the corridor. That's why his presence, silent, ceremonial, unmoving, wasn't just pageantry. It was a signal, a pressure valve, a way to say, this space is being watched. 12 minutes remained before the start of the closed-door panel. The house comms were already calling for final positioning. Water glasses placed. Doors softened. Aides with clipboards checking earpiece frequencies. Every motion rehearsed. Every second measured. And that's when Yuan noticed something new. From across the main chamber, a man in a navy suit, a US aide, judging by the lapel pin and the posture, was scanning the perimeter. His gaze skipped past cameras and cordons, then landed on Yuan and paused. Not on his face, on the table. The aide's eyes narrowed ever so slightly at the small green chain of custody tag affixed to the envelope beside Yuan's post. A minor detail to most, but not to everyone. The aide didn't approach. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned his head just enough to catch the eye of a man standing near the rear doors. Tall, shaven head, generic suit. One of the private security contractors traveling with the US team. The two men exchanged a look, not alarmed, not overt, but curious, calculating. And from that quiet look across the room, the next misunderstanding began. It started, as these things always do, with a whisper. Not in a back room, not through encrypted channels, just a murmur passed from one suited man to another, near the hors d'oeuvres table. "He's got something." The voice was low, casual, the kind of tone used when discussing internal memos or pre-brief leaks. But it came from a fixer, a UK-based liaison with dual citizenship, often hired to smooth the logistics between visiting American delegations and London venues. His job was to make sure the right people shook the right hands and nothing embarrassing happened on camera. He wasn't prone to paranoia, but he was ambitious. And the moment his eyes caught the chain of custody tag beside the guard's post, he didn't see ceremonial procedure. He saw leverage, or risk, or both. He leaned toward a junior contractor from the American security team and tipped his chin subtly toward Staff Sergeant Ewan Hart. That guard, red uniform, standing near the west corridor, he's holding a courier envelope. So, chain of custody tag, that means it's logged. Official. He sipped his drink. "I've worked these before, and that kind of envelope doesn't sit at elbow height unless it's in motion. I think he's carrying something the Americans don't want made public." "Like what?" The fixer shrugged. "I'm not saying it's sensitive. I'm saying if it was, would you want the press to catch it walking past the cameras with a guardsman?" The contractor looked again, more carefully this time. The truth, of course, was simple. The envelope wasn't in motion. It was part of an exhibit transfer log. Standard archival procedure, dull as it gets. But standing beside a Coldstream guard, gleaming in scarlet with not a blink out of place, the image looked important. And in rooms like this, optics were everything. The contractor didn't move yet, but the idea had been planted. If the object mattered, and if the person carrying it wasn't one of theirs, that could mean risk. Or worse, embarrassment, the kind that played badly in headlines. Across the room, Staff Sergeant Hart remained precisely where he'd been for the past 20 minutes. No fidget, no twitch, just presence. Waiting, controlling the corridor without appearing to. But not everyone was content to watch. The look between the fixer and the contractor was noticed, just barely, by a woman standing near the rear doors. Elderly, composed, wearing a cream coat with a regimental brooch pinned to her lapel. She didn't say anything. She didn't interrupt. She simply began drifting, slowly, deliberately, toward the west corridor, as if stretching her legs. The sort of person no one noticed until it was too late to take anything back. They didn't come shouting. That's not how it works in places like this. They came with smiles, with practiced body language and neutral expressions. Two men, American, mid-30s, security contractor types. And one had the tall build and tucked tie of a former Marine. The other, leaner, moved like he'd once done surveillance work, but now lived in fitted suits and biometric access passes. They approached from the reception hall at a diagonal, not straight on. That was intentional. A calculated angle, casual but not aimless. One of them made a slight show of adjusting his earpiece as they walked, like he was responding to an unseen comms ping. The other nodded faintly at Ewan, as if they were on the same side of something. Ewan didn't acknowledge them. He saw them 10 steps out. At 6 steps, the taller one spoke, his voice calm, professional. "Sergeant, we need to move our principal through here, security preference, less visible." Ewan didn't glance at them. His gaze stayed forward, fixed on the central junction of the corridor. "No passage via west. Authorized route is east," he said. It wasn't dismissive. It was procedural. A recitation of assignment. The leaner man gave a tight smile. "We understand, but for operational flexibility, we'd like to reroute, quietly." "No passage via west," Ewan repeated. "Venue directive, fire route and asset control enforced." There was a pause. The taller man looked down the hallway behind Ewan. Empty, polished, quiet. He stepped half a foot closer, just inside polite space. "Our team leads this detail. We'll take responsibility." Ewan's posture didn't shift. "I carry no authority to yield that responsibility. West corridor remains closed." His voice wasn't louder, but the tone changed, barely. A cold edge, wrapped in formality. The moment hovered, Not long. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then the contractors exchanged a glance, calculated, frustrated. They stepped back. The leaner one nodded, not warmly. Understood. And they turned, walking slowly, not retreating, but reconsidering. Behind them, near the gilded double doors, the elderly woman with the regimental brooch had paused beside a display of historical military medals. She didn't speak, just watched. Not the men. Ewan. She knew the posture. She'd seen it before, years ago, in hospital corridors and burial grounds. And in that single exchange, polite, bloodless, precise, the American detail had tested the boundaries of the house. And lost. There was no announcement, no formal call to attention. But everyone knew the moment the former president arrived. The shift wasn't audible so much as gravitational. The temperature in the main reception seemed to drop half a degree. Conversations stuttered, postures straightened. Even the wait staff adjusted their trays like a camera had been turned on. He entered not from the front, where most were watching, but through a controlled side access, usually reserved for royalty or senior ministers. No fanfare, just presence. Tall, broad-shouldered, still carrying the unmistakable performance energy of someone who used to hold entire rooms with a glance. He wore a navy suit, sharp enough to slice paper, and a tie in a muted patriotic stripe. Behind him followed 2 aides, a bodyman, and a security coordinator with eyes like ice and hands that didn't stay still. The cameras in the press pen stirred like animals, sensing a shift in wind. Flashes began again, not shouted requests, but bursts of light from lenses too fast to restrain. The velvet rope held, but tension crept into it, like a taut wire. Staff Sergeant Ewan Hart didn't move. His line of sight remained fixed on the West Corridor junction, but he saw everything. The former president's eyes never drifted toward the guard. Not at first, but his body man did. Younger, clean-shaven, suit too modern for the room. He scanned faces like a man trained to spot patterns. When he saw Ewan, stone still in scarlet, he did what most do, tried to read the uniform. Then his eyes caught on the envelope. Just a flicker. The chain of custody tag visible at waist height. Clean and official. The bodyman stepped a little closer to his principal and said something low. A lean in. A finger, not pointed, but hovered in Ewan's general direction. The former president turned his head slightly. Not fully. Just enough. Their eyes never met. But his glance locked on the envelope, then flicked back toward his security lead. Another whisper. No nod. No smile. Just a tightening of the jaw. Across the floor, one of the younger influencers near the rope whispered too loudly, "That's him." Several heads turned. Phones came up. But Ewan was already watching something else. A group of school children, accompanied by a sponsor from a national trust, moving past the rope on a pre-cleared tour. They wore little paper tags with house crests and plastic badges clipped to their lapels. One girl, maybe 9, walked at the end of the line and paused near Ewan. She stared up at him, at the bearskin hat, the white gloves, the boots. Her mouth opened slightly, like she wanted to say something but didn't dare. She didn't speak, just watched, like she wasn't sure if he was real. Then she hurried to catch up with her class, and just like that, the moment passed. But inside the former president's camp, something had begun to calcify. The whispers were circling now. The guard has something. And none of them knew yet just how badly they'd misunderstood. The room was quiet, in the way only diplomatic spaces ever truly are. That specific coiled silence before scheduled remarks, when all the murmuring has died down, but the talking hasn't yet begun. Glasses were set aside, notes straightened, heads inclined toward the front, where an undersecretary was about to introduce the panel. And then it happened. Not with a shout, not with a scene, with a sentence. 7 words. Uttered not as a joke, not in private, but into the air like an order meant to be obeyed. Arrest that man, and right there, him. The voice was unmistakable, confident, commanding, public. The former president wasn't shouting, but the tone was amplified by silence. His arm extended, not dramatically, but enough. He was pointing, directly at the guard. For a breathless moment, the entire room didn't register what had just been said. It was too sharp, too strange, too out of place. Arrest who? Then heads turned, slowly, confused. Staff Sergeant Ewan Hart remained completely motionless, still facing the corridor, still guarding nothing but protocol. He didn't move, didn't flinch, but the atmosphere snapped. Two members of the American private security detail reacted instantly, not violently, just instinctively. They moved forward 3 paces toward Ewan's position, hands lowered but ready, not weapons drawn, but posture loaded. On the UK side, everything froze. Venue staff stood suspended mid-task. The steward, June, dropped the pen from her tablet. A Met Police constable, stationed near the east exit, reached for his radio but didn't key it, not yet. This wasn't an ordinary confrontation. It was a problem of jurisdiction. A former US president, now a private citizen, had just issued a public directive in a British diplomatic building, under the protection of UK law, to detain a British soldier in uniform on royal assignment, and no one quite knew whether it was a misstatement or a trigger. Some in the crowd gasped audibly, others simply raised their phones, drawn by instinct, already filming. One of the American contractors lifted his hand halfway, motioning to Ewan. "Sir, step forward, please." He was calm, trained, but the phrase landed like a spark in dry grass. June, the steward, moved instinctively between the contractor and the corridor. "This is a pubberin venue," she said firmly. "No personnel may be detained without metropolitan oversight." The contractor ignored her. "We have authority under—" "You don't," said a second voice, sharper. It came from the Met duty officer near the security desk. His voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. "You don't arrest a Coldstream guard on assignment. Not without cause. Not in this building. Not in this country." And still, Ewan did not move. He didn't respond to the voice, or the pointing, or the encroachment. He simply waited. 1 foot, still behind the rope line, one eye on the corridor. Not because he didn't hear, because he knew something nobody else in the room yet did. The room held its breath. Security contractors poised like coiled wires. Venue staff frozen mid-step. A dozen phones still raised, recording with half belief, half hunger. Unsure whether they were witnessing a diplomatic incident or a misunderstanding gone viral. Staff Sergeant Ewan Hart took 1 step forward, deliberate, controlled, not hurried. The sound of his boot heel meeting the floor was so precise it seemed to echo. He didn't speak immediately. He reached with gloved hands to the small table beside him, where the sealed envelope had sat, ignored, for over an hour. His posture remained perfect as he lifted it, not dramatically, not like someone clutching a secret, but like a man returning a signed object to its rightful chain of command. Then he spoke, not loud, not timid, just clear. "Chain of custody packet for Palace Archives, logged by Registrar Office 1430, witnessed. I am not its owner." The words weren't a defense. They were procedure, statement of fact, anchored by policy. He extended the envelope slightly, not toward the American security team, but down the corridor, in the direction of the incoming UK registrar's aide, who was just now hurrying in behind a Met constable. And then, without a pause or flourish, Ewan reached inside his tunic. Not quickly, not covertly. A second envelope emerged, smaller, cleaner, marked with a different seal, one from the Royal Collection Trust, addressed to a government registrar by name. This was the real packet, the one with contents under procedural review. Not scandalous, not criminal, but significant. He held it in his hand, visible but untouched by anyone else. Only then did he add, voice still steady, "Secondary transfer for review by UK registrar. Contents not opened, authority reserved by venue." The room was still, not out of respect, out of recalculation. Across the carpet, a movement, slow, soft, broke the silence. The elderly woman with the regimental brooch stepped beside June, folding her hands just above her waist. Her voice, when it came, was gentler than anyone expected. "Give him room." No panic, no accusation, just instruction. The kind that doesn't need force to carry weight. The contractors glanced at each other. The taller one exhaled through his nose. They didn't retreat, not fully, but they stopped moving. Someone in the crowd lowered their phone. Then another. For the first time since the command had been issued, the room wasn't watching for drama. It was watching for clarity. Ewan said nothing more. He hadn't resisted. He hadn't argued. He hadn't raised a hand or a voice. He'd stepped forward, spoken 4 sentences, and shifted the gravity of the room. The man who stepped in next didn't wear a weapon on his belt. He didn't need to. Inspector Callum Fraser, Metropolitan Police Diplomatic Liaison, moved with the quiet certainty of someone who didn't ask for attention, but always got it. Navy jacket unbuttoned, radio clipped to his shoulder, notebook already out. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for silence. He simply walked into it. The crowd parted instinctively. Even the US contractors gave him space. Not out of deference, but recognition. This wasn't their jurisdiction. Fraser's eyes swept the room, took in the scene, then landed on Ewan, who still stood in the same deliberate posture, envelope in hand, eyes forward. He approached with measured steps, then stopped precisely 1 pace from the guard's position. "Staff Sergeant Hart," he said calmly. "Sir," Ewan replied, "are you in possession of any item not logged with venue staff?" "No, sir." "Has any object changed hands without clearance since you assumed position?" "No, sir." "Is the document in your possession currently tagged, signed, and awaiting formal handover per Royal Collection Protocol?" "Yes." "Sir." Each answer clipped, not robotic, disciplined. Fraser gave a small nod, then turned to the contractors standing just off-centre, trying and failing to look uninvolved. "May I ask who requested an arrest?" One of them hesitated. The leaner man answered, "Our principal believed there was a potential breach of—" "That's not what I asked," Fraser cut in, still perfectly polite. "Who requested the arrest?" Silence. Then, behind them, a voice spoke, measured but unmistakable. The directive came from me. It was the former president himself, no longer raised, no longer defiant, just cold, dismissive. I issued the command. I was told he was carrying something dangerous. Inspector Fraser's pen moved across the page. "And what was the basis for that information?" A pause. The bodyman opened his mouth, then closed it again. "No comment," the former president said finally. Fraser nodded, still writing. "Understood. No detainment will be made. This matter falls under UK jurisdiction. You are guests here." The statement wasn't inflammatory. It was logistical. And in rooms like this, logistics were everything. The contractors looked toward their lead. He didn't move. They took 1 step back. And just like that, the air began to shift again. From tension to containment, from escalation to process. The chain of command, invisible only moments ago, had reasserted itself. And the guard had never left his post. There was no gasp, no dramatic flourish, just paper. The kind of paper that rustles against itself with a quiet authority. Thin sheets, neatly stacked, official in that understated way only government documents can be. The registrar's representative had arrived, late, but precisely on time. Her ID badge was visible, her gloves white. She said nothing as she extended her hand. Ewan handed the smaller envelope over without ceremony. The room watched as if it were a live transfer of a crown jewel, but what passed between them weighed almost nothing. One gloved hand to another, then immediately sealed into a padded sleeve and logged in Fraser's notebook by time, location and witness. No one in the room, not even the former president's team, interfered. Inspector Fraser gestured to the registrar aide. "You may open it here." She did. No codes, no spy names, no footage or flash drives, just documents, dozens of them. Inside, routing memos from a cultural exchange council tied to a non-governmental NGO. Hospitality schedules, showing dates of private dinners and fundraising events. Wire transfer instructions, highlighting donation flows across continents, from London to the Gulf, from New York to Zurich. Each document on its own was mundane, bureaucratic, dull. But read together, a pattern began to take shape. private donations tied to official appearances, cultural venues pressured to grant access on symbolic dates. Attempts, never directly stated, but suggested, to photograph select guests near royal collection assets for use in private fundraising campaigns. The names were mostly redacted, but the initials, the stamps, the timing, they lined up too well with known events. Enough to imply ethics violation, influence peddling, the quiet, procedural corruption that never made headlines but reshaped entire diplomatic channels. A staffer standing near the registrar breathed a word under her breath. Coordinated. That was the danger. Not treason, not espionage, optics. Optics strong enough to warrant investigation, strong enough to require someone, anyone, to stop the documents from being quietly taken back across the Atlantic. And that's what Ewan had done. He hadn't exposed a scandal. He'd prevented a revision of what the record would show. The former president's legal advisor leaned in close, whispering something sharp. The principal didn't respond. His eyes were on the registrar's hands, now repackaging the papers under Met observation. Inspector Fraser cleared his throat. "We'll take custody of this copy for audit review." And just like that, the question wasn't what was inside anymore. It was why someone wanted it gone so quietly. Phones lowered, cameras stopped rolling, because suddenly no one wanted to be seen reacting too strongly. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning now, not because it had grown louder, but because no one was speaking. Not the donors, not the aides, not the press, not even the whisper-happy dignitaries who'd hovered near the wine table just 20 minutes earlier. The stillness didn't feel frozen, it felt held. A waiter, unaware of the weight in the room, set down a glass too hard on a tray. The soft clink cracked the air like a firecracker. He blushed, stepped back, said nothing. Across the gallery, a delegate from the Cultural Commission whispered into her phone, face pale. One of the younger American security aides thumbed anxiously at a ring on his finger, still staring at the table where the registrar had packed away the envelope. Even the former president had gone quiet. He wasn't fuming now. He was calculating, jaw tight, one hand on his cufflink, the other at his back. There was no version of this moment he could spin, not right away, not in this room. And amid it all, the guard stood still, not triumphant, not smug, simply present. Back to attention, posture reset. A ceremonial piece of furniture almost, but now seen differently. Near the far rope, the little girl from the school group had returned. No one noticed her at first. She stood quietly, close to the line, her hand still clutching a small program folded in half. She tilted her head at Ewan, wide-eyed. Then, awkwardly, without coordination, she lifted her fingers to her brow. Not a real salute, not proper, just a child's version, a guess, a gesture. Ewan didn't move, but his eyes, just for a fraction of a second, lowered, met hers, acknowledged. That was enough. The child smiled, turned and walked back to her group. The air shifted again, this time gently. No statement made, no headline written. But something in the room had changed, not because of what had been said, because of what had been upheld. Inspector Fraser didn't rush the close. He let the silence breathe a little longer. Gave the room time to recompute, everyone recalibrating where they stood, what they'd seen, how they'd explain it later without implicating themselves. Then, quietly, he turned back to Ewan. "You may offer a statement if you wish, Sergeant." Ewan didn't nod, didn't shift, but after a second he spoke, just one sentence. "I don't decide what's true. I protect the root, the object, and the record, so others can." That was it. It didn't sound like much on the surface, but in rooms like this, ceremonial, political, hierarchical, those words landed like a verdict. Not a boast, not an indictment, a definition. And the moment they were spoken, the roles in the room shifted. The contractors, arms folded now, exhaled without realizing. The political aides, scribbling crisis notes, slowed their pens. Even the former president's team, who had bristled with control minutes earlier, took a half step back into the crowd, because what Ewan said wasn't a defense. It wasn't emotional. It was doctrine. The people who understood really understood. Like the steward June, like the inspector, like the registrar, they exhaled first. June whispered to no one in particular, "That's why he's here." Even the elder woman with the regimental brooch nodded slightly. Not like she'd been proven right, but like she'd seen something she hadn't seen in a very long time. And standing behind the child from the school group, a father leaned down and said, "That's what standing looks like." The registrar's representative sealed the padded envelope into a transfer case, snapped 2 metal clasps, and passed it, without a word, to a metropolitan officer. He logged the time, 15:41. The officer turned, gave a silent nod to Inspector Fraser, and led the registrar out the same side route she'd entered, flanked by 1 additional constable. No red carpet, no audience. Just the sound of hard shoes on polished stone, disappearing down a government hallway. The room didn't applaud. It didn't even move much at first. But bit by bit, like rainwater returning to the seams of a pavement, the event resumed. Someone behind the rope line whispered, "Was that planned?" No one answered. From the side gallery, a press handler stepped out, adjusted her badge, and gently tapped the mic beside the stage. It squawked faintly. The scheduled remarks were back on. The cultural liaison reappeared with a half sheet of talking points, her posture tense but functional. She handed it off to the moderator, who readjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience." Backstage, someone gave a signal. The cameras were allowed to roll again, this time on script, pointing toward the designated backdrop and speaker panel. As for the former president and his team, they did not leave. They simply shifted positions. The arrest order was never acknowledged. One of the aides spoke softly to a nearby journalist. It was a misheard instruction, standard procedural mix-up. No one challenged it, no one confirmed it. Because in diplomatic rooms, truth doesn't always win, it just settles. And Ewan? He returned to post. He didn't glance toward the departing documents. He didn't change stance, didn't check his watch, didn't ask for clarification. He simply resumed his assigned position near the west corridor, one boot gently scuffed into its marble seam. Eyes forward, presence measured, not rewarded, reinstated. That was the final signal the room needed, not a headline. Just the rope line settling back into a gentle sway, velvet resuming its shape. The way it always does after a disruption that's been contained, not erased, not denied, just resolved, quietly, properly, without theatre. The panel began. The microphone clicked once, then held. The speaker at the lectern, a senior cultural liaison, opened with a line of gratitude and an apology for the delay. Her voice was calm, her hands didn't shake, but no one was really listening, because something in the air had changed. It wasn't the words, it was the way people were watching now. Phones that had once been held high were lowered fully, tucked back into pockets, or left face down on the tables. Guests leaned in, not to record, but to observe. The crowd was quieter now, the room softer. There was less spectacle, more attention. A wealthy donor near the front, who earlier had chuckled into his champagne at the commotion, now removed his cap entirely and held it at his side, not because anyone told him to, but because it suddenly felt right. A UK official, standing along the edge of the room, murmured to a colleague, "This is why we use chain of custody." It wasn't a political statement, it was a logistical one, but it landed like a proverb. Across the room, the school children had settled again, not squirming now, not whispering. The little girl who'd saluted stood quietly near her parent, fingers still clutched around her crumpled program. She looked up and asked softly, "Is he in trouble?" The parent glanced toward Ewan, still standing at post. Still the same expression, the same bearing. "No," they replied, "he remembered the rules." The child nodded, solemn, like she'd learned something she couldn't quite name, and in that small exchange, everything that needed to be understood was. The corridor was empty again, not abandoned, cleared, restored, returned to its intended state. The west route, once knotted with press angles and contractor presence, now stood open and still. The gold trim along the skirting board caught the afternoon light just slightly. The velvet rope, which had swayed during the disruption, now hung evenly, centered again between its polished brass stanchions. And Ewan? He hadn't moved, but beneath his left boot, the faintest scuff in the marble had aligned perfectly with the seam between tiles. A habit, not vanity. Guards notice details like that. You stand for hours, you find your mark, you settle into it. Raindrops, carried in earlier by shoes and coats, had left soft speckled residue on the floor. One bead clung to the brass post nearest Ewan's elbow, refracting the gallery lights like a jewel. Unnoticed by most, not wiped away. The envelope was gone, the crowd subdued, the incident already being rewritten in whispered retellings, hedged guesses, and soon by omission. But in that moment, in that space, everything was back where it belonged. Not by power, not by force, by presence, by procedure. The kind no one remembers unless someone forgets. If someone publicly ordered you to break protocol, would you obey? Or stand your ground like the guard did today? And in moments like this, do you believe discipline can speak louder than argument? Let me know in the comments. And if this moment spoke to you, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a daily story like this one. Share this video with someone who thinks tradition is just costume. Your next guard story is already on screen. Watch that next. And I'll see you tomorrow, same time.